This is Locked On Sports Atlanta, and it's time for the Atlanta Football Party, only on Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into the Atlanta Football Party, your home for the best Atlanta Falcons football talk. It's local insight you can't get anywhere but right here at Locked On. I'm your host, Tenitra Batiste. Alongside me, our Falcons analyst, Jarvis Davis, Locked On Falcons host, Aaron Freeman, and senior Falcons reporter, Tori McElhaney. The Atlanta Football Party is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So has Jeff Ulbrich rounded out his staff the right way? We'll continue our download on who passed this season and who didn't. And what did the excellence we saw Sunday tell us about what we want to see here next season? We'll discuss that and how important it is to have a presence in Mobile, Alabama and Arlington, Texas this week. First, our reactions to what Ulbrich had to say today when the Falcons officially introduced him as their new defensive coordinator. So what I did, guys, was just pull some of the tweets that Tori sent out. Tori obviously was there in person for Jeff's presser and just kind of wanted us to react to that. So Tori, I will start with you. And of course, pulled another one from our buddy, Josh Kendall over at The Athletic to kind of mesh together some of the key points that Ulbrich touched on. So here's one, Tori. He was asked about returning to Atlanta with Coach Raheem Morris, and why Jeff believes things will be differently in this partnership because of how both men have evolved personally and professionally. So here's part of the quote, and then I'll get to the rest. My core principles are the same. My football brain is in a different place. It all has to do with the multiplicity of the game and pivoting in the moment and inserting more variety, more coverage, more scheme. But for you, if his core principles are the same, how different do you think things can really be this time around?
I think that we will see. I think that I actually had the chance to sit down with him one-on-one before his press conference, which you can actually watch that interview on Atlanta Falcons YouTube page. It's up right now, so go check that out. It was about 10, 15 minutes that we had just to catch up and talk. And I asked the question to him. I was like, how are you different sitting here in front of me today than when we were on a Zoom call together back in 2020? And I thought what he had to say was, he said the right things, because he said he went back to his experience with New York and how important it was. And he later said this in the press conference where he was like, Raheem and I needed to get out of Atlanta, needed to have more experiences, needed to see what else is out there, to evolve as play callers, to evolve as leaders and decision makers. And something that he said that I think is very true of all of us. He was like, I'm not the same person that I was 4 or 5 years ago. And I know, and the thing is like, I believe him when he says that, because I'm not the same person that I was 4 or 5 years ago. And I think I understand, and I've said this on podcasts, on our podcast, I've said this here, I understand the ire and the frustration of the fan base with this decision. I absolutely do, because I had the same qualms about it. Like, are you just rinsing and repeating, doing the same thing that you did before? Is that where you're going? And I think to a certain extent, you're always going to have that question until somebody proves you else. Like, but the thing about it is, like, at least give him an opportunity to go one way or the other. And I think that was the big thing where he was talking about how his football brain has changed, and talked about the importance of being multiple and having this idea of like not just game planning week of, but game planning in the moment, play by play. He said one of the major things that I took from his press conference, as well as my conversation with him, was that he said that he didn't think that they necessarily, the first time around, that he and Raheem did a good job with when a offense would pivot, the defense would pivot and account for it. And I think that is something that he said that he took with him moving forward into his time with the Jets, which, yes, he was. I know everybody's like, oh, it's Robert Saleh's defense. It's Robert Saleh's defense. Well, when I was talking to him, he was like, after that first year, Robert was dealing with other things. And he had a very hands-off approach, and there was this trust. And you look at what the Jets did in the last few years with Jeff Ulbrich being the guy, the leader of the unit, they were a top 5 defense. in a few categories. So I say all of that to say, just give him a chance to prove you wrong or prove you right. And the decision's been made. He doesn't really even know at this point what his defensive unit is even going to look like. I felt bad asking him questions about what his goal for the defense is or what the foundation is, because who the heck knows what this defense personnel wise is going to look like come September. But I'm kind of like, let's just wait and see. That's all we can do right now.
It really, really is. And Jarvis, I want to piggyback on something that Tori just said, and it's also part of something else that she tweeted out from Jeff. And basically, it's part of what she said, that his first time in Atlanta, he doesn't necessarily feel that the Falcons had an answer defensively, as she mentioned, when offenses pivoted in game specifically. It's something he said was a key learning for him moving forward in his own career. With that said, and kind of thinking about what Tori was able to glean in her one-on-one, did you see anything, or have you seen anything in Jeff's learning while he was in New York that maybe does encourage you to think in-game adjustments can be more effective in Atlanta under him?
I mean, I appreciate the transparency, because I was joking with one of the other media members after the press conference. I was like, man, I don't know if I would have admitted that in front of everybody. When you think about just excuse me, y'all, I'm in my library voice because I'm inside of a library and I'm trying to be quiet.
Oh, I thought it was your Barry White.
I'm not trying to be sexy. Yeah, I'm not trying to be
Barry White. Okay. I was just rolling with it. Like, if that's where you wanted to go on a Monday,
that's how I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling sexy, T. I appreciate you. Yeah.
Oh, man.
I gotta stop. I'm trying to be quiet. All right, so but yeah, but I think overall though, I appreciate that transparency, because like I said, I said this when we did the show right after he was hired, and I'll continue to say this. I respect Ulbrich as a coach. I respect what he brings to the table. I just think that when you have a familiar situation, it's going to be very interesting on how you handle those situations once it's live, because it's easy to talk about it, right? It's easy to say, hey, here's what we're going to do in these particular situations. But once those live bullets start flying, there's something that comes in you, and you got to be over whatever it is. You got to be overcome it, and you got to be able to communicate that to those players, and that's what matters. I think one thing that really stood out to me that is going to be true going forward. Players want to know why. It's easy for you to sit up there and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. But the good to great coaches, they're able to answer why. Here's why we're doing it. Here's when we're going to do it. And we're doing it in this particular situation because here's what they do in third and medium and third and short and stuff like that. So those are some of the things that I felt like I heard that was kind of promising, being that this is his second time around working with Rob, and it's going to have to work. It's going to have to work.
Yeah. And I think too, Jarvis, when we look at some of the things that I know I say for my team, but I'm sure that others say for their favorite team or the fan base for the Falcons and even media, is you want somebody who can push, right? Because Raheem Morris has a strong personality, and he is a defensive-minded coach, although obviously had OC experience as well. But you need somebody in that DC position that can actually push him if they are, convinced and positive that, hey, this is the way we need to go to be able to defend against this particular offense. And maybe that is something that also kind of is weaved into what Jeff Ulbrich has learned, such that he can say, hey, I can say this because I've got that to back up. That is actually something that low key, not to say Jimmy Lake didn't, push back here and there, but it's harder to push back when you're a first-time defensive coordinator in the NFL, as opposed to Jeff Ulbrich now, had the interim DC with the Falcons, has grown through 3 years of being a DC with the Jets, and has some good resume points to prove from when they were a top 5 defense across that 3-year time frame. So yeah, I think that those points that you guys both make are good points about why, hey, we do need to give Jeff an opportunity, even though we all kind of have a little bit of trepidation. There's still nothing wrong with giving him a little bit of an opportunity to kind of show. Now, this, Aaron, for me was an interesting comment as well. And I really want to hear from all three of you guys, because it's probably the bone of contention for just about everybody in the building in Flowery Branch and everybody in Atlanta Metro and anybody who calls themselves a Falcons fan, a supporter, or even someone who follows the team. So the quote was, there's no great defense in the league that has not affected the quarterback. Affecting the quarterback is my top priority. It's a combination of a lot of things. But I think for me, I said, is affecting the QB enough, considering that there was some affecting in 2024? There was just no real sacking, actually getting home on a consistent basis. So that's kind of my first question on that particular quote. And if we have some time, I'll go back to the second one. But that kind of stood out to me, Aaron, where I was like, affecting? Can we get a little deeper on what affecting means? Because we affected, we just didn't see the rest of the effect.
Yeah, I think that statement doesn't really land with this particular fan base just because of the lack of sack production that has been such a through line, I guess you could say. You know, the one thing that the Falcons do consistently or don't do consistently is not put the quarterback on the ground. That has been true for many years. But I think the more and more you surround yourself in NFL circles, I think most people understand that sacks can be a tad bit overrated. But I say those words, and a lot of people, you know, probably listening to this show in their car just swerved off the road or something like that because
let's hope not.
It triggers them in a major way. So I think Jeff Ulbrich is right that it's really about affecting the quarterback, getting pressure, you know, getting hits, not just, hey, the team that gets the most sacks matters. But we also know that sacks are extremely valuable and whatnot. But typically in an NFL game, you're only going to sack the quarterback 2 or 3 times. And so if you're really going to have success, you need to be able to affect the quarterback more than 2 or 3 times. You need to be able to create the pressure and create the hits, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 times or whatever. And so I think when coaches say those things, that's what they're really focusing on. But I think when Falcon fans and media hear that statement, it's just like you get triggered all over again.
Well, it's funny, Tenitra, that you bring this quote up because, he's talking about pass rush and he's talking about affecting the quarterback. And the question was, so are sacks your priority? Like that was the lead in. And he said, affecting the quarterback is my priority. Like, because he understands, he's a former linebacker. Like he understands that getting a quarterback off of his spot to create a chaos play. If like you think about Caden Ellis, how many times, especially early on when sacks weren't happening, but how many times did he get off the quarterback off of his spot and he threw the ball into the hands of Jessie Bates III? That is not ever going to go down on a stat sheet. Sometimes that's not even considered a quarterback hurry. Like sometimes depending on the way you measure things, that doesn't show up on a stat sheet. But you can't tell me that's not important. And it doesn't, to Free's point about how, you maybe get 1, 2, 3, 4 sacks in a game if you're lucky, but you can affect the quarterback on every single play. Yeah. And that's the difference. It's like, yes, sacks are a byproduct of this. Yes, sacks are important. Yes, sacks get you paid. And the Falcons need a sack master and a workhorse. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's much bigger than sacks. Sacks are the flashy part of it, but there's all the substance about affecting game plans and keeping quarterbacks uncomfortable that I think is what Jeff Ulbrich is speaking to. And the best defensive coordinators figure out ways to do it. We just saw it last night in the AFC Championship.
That's what I was about to talk about.
With the Kansas City Chiefs and what they were doing with their blitzes and up. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see examples of this. Yeah. It wasn't like Josh Allen was being sacked every other play, but he sure as heck was affected.
Yeah. And you look at the stat line and you see 8 QB hits and you see 2 sacks and you're thinking, okay, but if you look at the final stat line, the most important one, which is essentially 4th and 5 at the Buffalo 47, there was just enough pressure from that Chiefs team, from that Chiefs defense to get Josh Allen ever so slightly off his mark and cause that incompletion. And you knew that was game. So, I think that's a great point, Tori, to kind of go back to what the question was to yield the answer, but also to be fair. And we're still going to always want a sack master. We're still going to want somebody who can get the QB on the ground. But don't forget there's another piece of that matters as well, Jarvis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's the thing. Like, I want a defense that's going to terrorize quarterback. Like, yeah, you can take a sack, you can sack him 2 times, in a game, like Free mentioned, but you can still go 28 for 35 and throw for 300 yards and 2 tugs. Like, he can still have those, and you can sack him 2 times and you can lose, right? So for me, I feel like, yeah, given the history of, I'm sorry, I have to get back in my library voice. Given the history of this team not being able to put the quarterback on the ground, that's why there's such a heightened level for sacks or lust for sacks. Like, people really want the quarterback to put on the ground. But like, when you add to that, forcing errant throws, you have an all-pro, safety back there who can take the ball away, right? Hopefully, add another guy that can probably take the ball away that's really cheap on a rookie contract. Hint, hint, Terry. I know you're listening, bro. And then,
Terry listen to this?
of course he does. Come on, Terrell, of course he listens to this pod. Come on. He does the exact opposite of what we tell him to do. So yeah, we know. So I think, and then moving the quarterback off spot, you saw this last night too on the AFC Championship when knocking balls down.
Yeah.
You saw how frustrated Josh Allen was when those D tackles and that linebacker they had a spy on him, and as soon as he got rid of the football, jumping up, knocking that bad boy down. Next play, he didn't get sacked, but guess what? That messed with him. That's an incompletion. Like, that messes with quarterback, especially when it was there, right? So I think overall affecting the quarterback, yeah, I get it, I totally understand it, but we're a little sensitive down here when we're hearing it in Atlanta because we haven't had a consistent guy. And, that guy, Jalen Carter, he looked really good last night, too.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing, because he was one who only had a couple tackles, but doesn't matter. We saw how he was terrorizing.
Wrecking
and he's been doing that the entirety of the postseason, and his stats may not show it, but ask the QB from the opposing team what that felt like. So Ulbrich has rounded out his staff, but has he done it in the right way? We'll talk about that when we take it under further review. This episode of our Atlanta football party, is brought to you by Gametime. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. I can remember the excitement and energy of a playoff game that I've attended in recent years, and I'm looking forward to making new memories this season, really next season, hopefully with these Atlanta Falcons. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I've used Game Picks to find tickets for NFL games. I've used it for concerts as well. So browsing through the deals is simple, and you can find great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. And the super deal is especially impressive because it offers the best value for the event. The app features seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout. That makes the experience smooth. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Now, terms do apply, but again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, guys. So we think about the fact that we now have pretty much seen a rounded out coaching staff for Jeff Ulbrich. The Falcons obviously named Mike Rutenberg the defensive pass game coordinator and Nate Ollie the D-line coach. So for you, Aaron, what's the biggest advantage to having a defensive pass coordinator, having Rutenberg, and having a defensive pass game coordinator for this Falcons team?
Yeah, I mean, when you ask that question, I don't know, because you always wonder what exactly a defensive pass game coordinator does. What is their focus? They're part of the strategy of getting the defense prepared week in and week out, right? They're kind of like the right-hand man of the defensive coordinator, and they can really hone in on the passing game. And so you do wonder a little bit, okay, like what specifically aspect of the passing game? Are you looking at the route tree? Are you looking at the weapons? Are you looking at the quarterback? What element of that? And sort of you take that sort of holistically. But I think it is valuable to have someone like Mike Rutenberg, who had a lot of success in New York coaching the linebackers there. and sort of getting that element. We know that the linebacker position has not been one for the Falcons that has been as performing, I think, at the level outside of basically Caden Ellis, at the level that the Falcons have wanted these last couple of years. A lot of that is owed to Troy Anderson's injury. You do wonder if Mike Rutenberg can kind of help out, and if Troy Anderson's actually healthy for once, like we'll actually see positive production from him. Same thing goes with Nate Landman and JD Bertrand. So I think getting that type of addition to this coaching staff is meaningful, but you just kind of wonder, okay, what specific element of the passing game are you going to be bringing? And when you look at a linebacker coach, you're not necessarily looking at it from a pass rush standpoint. You're not really looking at it from a pure coverage standpoint, but maybe because of that specific role of the linebackers that help out in both areas, you get more of a bigger picture in that regard, and you can cover all your bases as opposed to just focusing specifically on one area.
And what for you, Jarvis, when you think about that particular hire, that defensive pass game coordinator, what's the biggest advantage, if there's an advantage, for that role?
I mean, when you think about the position that I feel like we're probably going to see some changes, right? It's going to look, the linebacker core is going to look a little different. It feels good that you're going to have a guy with some experience. And, one of the reasons why I always talk about, like, what's the core principle of that coach, right? Like, we know Jeff Ulbrich, he played linebacker, so linebacker is his spot. So we have somebody that's another set of eyeballs to be able to say, hey, here's what you need to do in this particular situation. Here's what you're going to do in coverage. Here's what you need to do as far as when you're communicating with the safety or you're communicating with your defensive lineman as far as high stunts and supposed to go with this particular pressure package. So all of those things, like the more eyeballs and insight, good insight. Let me emphasize that you can give to put these players in position to be successful, the better.
Yeah, Tori, I like that last part that Jarvis said as well. The insight that hopefully one more set of eyes on the ball, one more mind seeing the game a little bit differently could help the defense to be that more effective, and maybe that more effective faster, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how this staff ultimately works together and works off of each other, because you know that Raheem Morris and Jeff Ulbrich have a really good working relationship. They know each other really well. They trust each other a lot. But you also have to know that, okay, Jeff Ulbrich has brought in a couple of his guys. There's a lot of this defensive staff that is a carryover from last year. Jerry Gray's still around and has a huge role to play in what the Falcons are going to do on the back end. So it's going to be important to see, and this was actually something that Jeff Ulbrich talked a lot about today, was about how the next couple of weeks is like really integral and important for them figuring out who they are as a coaching staff, more than giving it to scheme wise, getting into like what each player can do. Who are these coaches together? Because right now you have a few different pockets coming from a few different things that are all going to try and collectively come together. And I think it's really interesting, the decisions that the people who Jeff Ulbrich decided to bring with him, the people who are still here on Raheem Morris's staff. I'm just curious, like right now I feel like this was a really good first day, but it's always these first days that leave me with more questions than I have answered, because at this point, like, it's not fair of me to ask him, so like, what do you think? Going back to the point that I made earlier, like, what do you think about like all of this? And like, and I even asked him, I was like, what's goal number one? And he was like, it's getting to know these players, who they are, what they do well, what their strengths are. And it's getting to know this coaching staff, because he is coming in here to work with a group of people that had a different coordinator 6 months ago.
True. And yeah, like you said, it's all just conjecture at this point, because we don't know until we know. And we're kind of at that point where I guess we're kind of tipping into that next space of starting to know, because obviously you guys have that, like you said, Tori, you had the one-on-one conversation with Jeff. That was kind of the first peek into, the new era, the next era for 2025. And then of course, Aaron's in Mobile. He's going to be looking at players at the Senior Bowl who could potentially be those players. Jarvis is on his way. So I think, we're kind of at the first step, if you will, of what this new side, at least on the defensive side of the ball, what the new look defense could look like and how advantageous it could be. Other piece there is the D-line coach, because we talked more about that after we had our conversation about Jeff Ulbrich saying that, hey, that position may be, and of course, not overstating it, but that position may be just as important, if not at times more important, because that's one of the places where you desperately need that help, Jarvis, where you need to see someone who can come in and help this team win more in the trenches, win more up front. So now knowing Nate Ollie, as Tori mentioned, I think he was with Jeff for a year in New York, comes to Atlanta as the D-line coach. What are some of the advantages of maybe having him in that role?
Well, go back to 2023, where he had 4 guys who had at least 7 sacks on the squad, and they had a consecutive streak. I think it was like 4 or 5 sacks in consecutive games. So when you think about that type of production, yes, yes, we need that. Yes, and I even said to myself before they hired him, I said this is going to be an important hire for this staff, because I feel like this defensive line, not only they have talent. I'm not saying that there's some talent on this defensive line right now as we speak. I just think that they need to be guided more. They need to be directed more. They need to be trained more to do the right thing on a consistent basis. And therefore, if you're able to do that, you're able to get more production. Now, granted, you need more, that's for sure. But I think that, Zach Ollie is a guy that has some cachet. And he's had multiple guys produce, because they need multiple guys, to produce and put the quarterback on the ground or affect the quarterback, like Ulbrich mentioned. So yeah, I'm encouraged about this hire, because and of course he spent some time as assistant defensive lineman with the Texans last year, so he got a pretty solid resume for sure.
I think it's important too that there is that familiarity with Jeff Ulbrich, going back to the point that I was making before, like the fact that he's not coming into a staff where he only has the working relationship with the head coach and nobody else. There are a lot of guys on this staff that he has never worked with before. I would say the vast majority he has never worked with before. So the fact that he has a couple of his guys that can kind of help marry all of these different philosophies together to ultimately find what they want to do. And let's be honest, to Jarvis's point, I think this defensive front is kind of at a crossroads now in a way that they haven't been up to this point, because you've been so reliant on Grady Jarrett to be the guy for you. And he's been the guy for you for a very, very, very long time. But you're coming to the point where you have to ask questions about life beyond Grady Jarrett in the interior. Do you have somebody on the roster who is that heir apparent for the position, or multiple heir apparents? We talk about guys coming off of the edge. Like, do you have someone on the roster now that you feel good about leading you into the future with this defense? I don't know. I think this is going to be a very, very important offseason for this defense, because you have got to make big decisions about your defensive line, your linebackers, and your secondary. There are pieces across the entire unit that you have to answer, and you have to start thinking about, the strategy of building this Atlanta Falcons team. You feel good about where the offense is. They put so much time, effort, money into that side of the ball. Now you have to address your deficiencies defensively. And the only way to do that is kind of to take this stuff head on. And I'm also kind of curious, like Jeff Ulbrich and, Mike Ruttenberg and Nate Ollie, like what type of body types are they looking for? I think about someone like Zach Harrison. Like, what is his role going to look like? Do they feel like he is someone who is kind of an heir apparent? Do they like what he's doing from the interior, or do they feel value with him coming off the edge? Like, there are so many questions I have about personnel that this group, I think, is going to have their hands in a lot.
Yeah. And I think piggybacking on those points, like a big point of emphasis over the next couple of months is going to be all the additions that the Falcons make to their defense to help them make improvements this upcoming season. But then when we get to September, a lot of it is going to be not only those players' additions, but also the internal growth of some of the young players that we've seen this coaching staff come in, and we didn't quite see them be able to, quote unquote, fix, Richie Grant, who's now headed to free agency. And I think the expectation is that the Falcons will move on to Richie Grant, but you still have several young defensive players from 2022, 2023, and now 2024 that you really expect to grow into something. And so adding a coach like Nate Ollie to the defensive line and Mike Rutenberg to the linebacker core, you're really hoping that, okay, we're not going to have a Richie Grant 2.0 type situation where we're just going to watch these guys just sort of go into their contract years and do nothing. And then we'll just be like, well, we got to start all over and draft new replacements for those guys. You want to be able to maximize. You want to be able to say, piggybacking on what Tori's saying, you know, Arnold Ebiketie, he is one of those guys for the edge.
Yeah.
Ray Anderson, he is one of those guys for the linebacker position. Zach Harrison, Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, all those guys are pieces that we can build this defense around. And so I think that's a big part of what you're hoping to get out of this coaching staff.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll continue our download on who passed this season and who didn't, just like the guy said, who's going to be potentially the personnel or not for the Falcons next season. We'll talk about it when we run it back. All right, guys. So continuing our series to just kind of do an in-depth end of season eval on the 2024 season. Of course, we'll go around the room grading the position groups, giving our thoughts on where the Falcons need to upgrade, decide if that upgrade should come through the draft or free agency, and maybe who it's time to say goodbye to because you need to be upgraded. So that said, we'll stay on the defensive side of the ball and dive into the secondary. Tori, grade that position group for us. Give us your thoughts on where the Falcons need to upgrade, which means somebody's going to be out of a job.
Right.
But decide if the upgrade also should come through the draft or free agency.
Yeah. So I feel like the secondary is so hard because I feel like I have different grades for different guys and different parts of it. Like Jessie Bates, love the guy. Love watching him play. Great guy all around. Justin Simmons, I don't necessarily think that you got what you were hoping to get out of him, but I don't think it was a complete like wash. I think just because he wasn't putting up the numbers that like were his Pro Bowl years with the Denver Broncos doesn't mean that it was a bad decision or that it didn't work out. I think that what Justin Simmons was able to do, even for Jessie Bates and the rest of the guys in the secondary, was notable. A.J. Terrell, I think, continued to be a shutdown guy. I think that people are not giving him the credit that he deserves from a national perspective. And I think he played up to the contract that the Falcons gave him. Mike Hughes, I think, had a lot better of a year than what anyone gave him credit for. I actually go back and forth as to whether or not, like, do you bring Mike Hughes back? If it's one of those things where you want to put a lot of money into that defensive front and you want to hold off on putting some money into the secondary, like, can you bring Mike Hughes back on a cap-friendly couple-year deal? Because I liked what I saw from him. I thought when you look at his numbers, when he was out there, he was impactful. I think the main part of the secondary that has to see significant upgrades, though, is at nickel. That's the one area that I felt the inconsistencies of, especially if you had Nate Landman in when you couldn't necessarily trust like his coverage abilities. And so you kind of, I don't know, the middle of the field was, I felt a very soft part of what this defense was doing in the secondary. So I think that that's a really, really, if only Cooper DeJean was, still available, that would have been great, but that's not the case that we're in. And I think when you're looking at all of this, I've said for so long that I wanted consistency opposite AJ Terrell. I've said it every single year, every single offseason, that I wanted them to find basically a running mate for AJ Terrell. And I think you have a very, very good opportunity to do that. But now I think because of where they are, I wouldn't be above that running mate coming in the form of a nickel. And I don't know if that's drafting someone. I kind of lean more towards free agency. I would like to see that position, because of the nature of it, have a vet in there. But overall, I give the secondary a B-, because I have kind of like Jessie Bates, AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes as these like A-B players. But then I also have some C and D moments. I think about the freaking Minnesota game. Yeah. And so I think that is, I don't know. I think that this secondary has some holes that need to be filled. And that's why I can't necessarily give them anything higher than a B-.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair because it's almost like you have the top of the line and then a fall off, and then there's some in the middle. And how do you kind of grade them overall? So yeah, for you, Free, when you look at the secondary, what's your grade for that position group? And could be kind of a hybrid there in the same way. And give us your thoughts on where the Falcons need to upgrade and who's out as a result of that. And of course, if that upgrade for you should come through the draft or free agency.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn, similar to Tori, like between a B- and a C+.
Yeah.
Because I look at it as Tori laid out. Like you look at like 3 of the players in that 5-man secondary, I think performed at or above expectations, and she laid it out with Jessie Bates, A.J. Terrell, and Mike Hughes. And so that pushes me towards a B-. But then when I look at the fact that, well, they probably need to add 3 players to that secondary at the nickel, potentially at that outside corner, and replace 3 of those guys. That pushes me more towards a C+. So I'm, because my reputation is to be a little harsher than Tori. I will go with the C+ just to fulfill the prophecy and whatnot.
There you
go. I think when you look at this group, and I remember last offseason being concerned about talking about that outside cornerback spot opposite A.J. Terrell, which has been a revolving door since he got here, that I went into last offseason with the expectation, I don't know if the Falcons are going to be able to find their answer this offseason, in the offseason of 2024 for that spot. And it was the idea of, well, there's better luck next year. And now next year is here. And so I don't know if the Falcons can afford to punt that again this offseason. And piggybacking on what Tori says, I think Mike Hughes is worth bringing back as a free agent, but not in the sense of him being the plan A. He's more the plan B in the event, like say you draft a cornerback in the early rounds of the draft, and that guy doesn't have quite as strong a training camp as you want, and you have a Mike Hughes back there that can perform at a decent level as a starter, as your sort of insurance policy. But the goal is to upgrade that position, maybe with a draft pick as opposed to free agency. And then the same conversation can be had at that safety position opposite Jessie Bates. Do you draft another guy, knowing that you have DeMarco Hellams, you haven't had as much success with Richie Grant, or do you go out there and get a veteran like you tried to do with Justin Simmons, but maybe a player that maybe has a little bit more left in the tank there? So I think the Falcons can go in so many different directions this offseason in terms of addressing some of these concerns in the secondary. I think it's probably going to be a combination of both free agency and the draft in some form or fashion. But I think you want to get younger at that position group because we've talked about this, a number of times over the last couple of years, which is you do have some talented young pieces. Jessie Bates is, I think 27. I think A.J. Terrell's like 26, something like that. And so you have Clark Phillips, you have D. Alford, still young guys, relatively speaking, that still have growing and learning that they can do as well. So you can get more out of them in the future. So I feel like, adding to that secondary, adding youth, but also adding some of the veteran experience makes a ton of sense for the Falcons.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I was thinking, so I'm going to put you on the spot for just a quick second, but I was thinking, okay, same, agree with Tori, agree with you, but then who needs to go? Because somebody's going to lose a job based on the upgrade of this defense, based on the upgrade of the secondary.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could point to a lot of people that could lose a job, and I think the thing to do is, that's where competition matters, right? And so I think Justin Simmons could lose a job. I think Richie Grant could lose a job. I think D. Alford could lose a job. I think Mike Hughes could lose a job if you add the right pieces there and you feel like you have better assets moving forward.
What about you, Jarvis?
I would probably have to say, man, like a C+, because the only reason I think that plus because I think about how well A.J. Terrell played this year. So that's kind of like, it's kind of hard for me to kind of give him a C because like, man, he played so well when he was put in the right situations. And I think that's one thing you don't have to necessarily worry about. Obviously, Jessie Bates, you don't have to worry about. And I think Tori makes a great point. D. Alford is a guy that I thought that showed some promise, right? I feel like he was going to be a guy that's going to be able to stick around, but I feel like he may have taken a step back this year. So I don't know if you're sticking around with Jerry Gray, he helping out secondary. That's his kind of expertise, so he's helping out on that level. So I don't know if he can say, hey, maybe let me work with this guy, or let me kind of give me some more time with this guy. Maybe we can make him like maximize his talent a little bit more, and what he brings to the table. But I feel like the nickel spot is key. I feel like opposite of Mike, A.J. Terrell is key, and I kind of like the idea of bringing Mike Hughes back because you might be able to get him on a nice team-friendly deal. I don't like to use that word often, but with guys like him, I will use that term. But and for me, because I feel like there are so many other spots that I feel like you have to get better and younger, and guys that can are going to be on the field, and when they're on the field, they're performing. And I think that's that linebacker spot for me, and also obviously an edge guy, what I've been saying for the past 10 years.
Well, speaking of a guy that hits the field and we know he's going to perform, we know he is him. Looks like the NFL kind of knows it too. We'll talk about it when we look ahead. This episode of our Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. Kansas City Chiefs versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake, or should I say king cake, because it's in New Orleans. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. For just $5, if you win from that bet, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. Hey, we got the good word, guys, that finally the NFL sees what we've been seeing the entirety of the season. Of course, when the Eagles punched their ticket last night to the Super Bowl against the Commanders, it meant that in all likelihood, Saquon Barkley was not going to be a part of the Pro Bowl. But guess who got the nod and is going to be more than capable and is more deserved and is just as deserving of that? Bijan Robinson. So excited because he was voted a first alternate behind Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Josh Jacobs, and he'll join Chris Lindstrom and Kadarius Hodge. So when you think about that, Tori, and I know you posted an article on AtlantaFalcons.com about it, but just thinking about his second year, 1,456 yards, third in the NFL at the end of the season, averaging almost 5 yards a carry. I mean, there's so many things that you could say about him. But how exciting is it to know that the NFL is giving him his flowers?
It's well-deserved. And I honestly wish that it wasn't as like a first alternate because one of the guys is going to the Super Bowl. But, hey, you'll take it to get that exposure and for him to have that experience. I think that he had an all-pro season too. And it's a shame that he didn't at least get a second-team nod. Yeah. I understand the problem is like, if the Falcons, and I've said this before, I probably said it on this podcast, if not the other podcast that I'm on, but there were so many guys that had solid individual seasons, all pro seasons, Pro Bowl seasons, that because the Falcons didn't put together a winning season as a collective unit, those individual performances got overshadowed. And Bijan Robinson is one of those individuals. So it's nice that he got that like final push into something like the Pro Bowl. And it's fun because Bijan and I actually share a birthday, January 30th. So this coming Thursday. Nice. And so he'll be competing at the skills portion of the Pro Bowl games on his birthday, and I'll be getting massage and facial. So kind of basically the same thing.
Yes. Happy birthday, Tori.
Happy birthday. Happy free birthday. But I know you're going to celebrate in New Orleans. So, hey, it's going to, somehow you're going to get your celebration in. All good. If you're down there. But yeah, I think you make a great point, Tori, because when you look at the list, having Saquon and having Josh and Jahmyr on it, those are all teams that went to the postseason, two of which were predicted potentially to go to the Super Bowl. And of course, one of them did. So yeah, Jarvis, you look at that talent that Bijan has, and it's like, it was overshadowed by the unfortunate falling off the cliff of the Falcons at the end of the season, the backside of the season. But hey, as long as he's getting some recognition, I think is a beautiful thing too.
Absolutely. When you think about what Bijan Robinson brings to the table, this guy is amazing. He's amazing. When you think he and Jahmyr Gibbs are changing general managers' minds about running backs, right? And of course, it's going to take some time because, like, hey, running backs don't matter. Mike Shanahan came in there like, yeah, I don't care who's back there. They're going to rush for 1,000 yards, regardless of where they came from. Their fullback just get out the military and all that stuff. It's just, I think the way the game, and then Saquon Barkley helps too, what he's doing in the playoffs. That just lets you know that, okay, we understand throwing the ball around the yard, that's all cute and everything. But oh my gosh, when it comes down to, cutting time, during this time of year, if you are running the football with some success, when people know that you're going to be running the football, that is a recipe to get to the final game of the season. And I think Bijan Robinson is that guy. He can be that guy running for the Falcons, around this time of year. And I think that's why Terry Fontenot brought him in.
Yeah, Free. And you think about Bijan being that guy where he's coming at you, he's going to get the ball, and you still can't do anything about it. Yeah, I think that's one of those unique talents. And everything that he does, whether it's blocking, whether it's catching out of the backfield, he's always shooting for excellence. And I also think that's a great part of why his game has evolved so very quickly during his short time in the NFL.
Yeah, there was very little doubt how talented Bijan Robinson was when the Falcons drafted him. That term generational running back gets thrown around a ton. And oftentimes players don't quite live up to it, right? And I think Bijan has definitely lived up to it. And it's nice to see him getting that recognition. All of those guys had great seasons. Jahmyr Gibbs, Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley. I want to confuse Bijan, how you pronounce Bijan. I want to call him but Saquon Barkley all had great seasons. And so, as Tori said, I do feel like Bijan was kind of overshadowed this year, played as good as any running back in the league this year. But because he wasn't on a team, at least in the second half of the season, that was having a ton of success, it kind of went under the radar. And so finally he'll get an opportunity to showcase if anybody's sitting here questioning, that selection and his impact for this football team, now 2 years later, that will, I think they'll be quiet when we get later this weekend in terms of the Pro Bowl games.
Yeah, that's a you thing. That's a them problem, not the people on this podcast, because we know, having seen it up close and personal. But when you think about a Saquon Barkley and what we saw out of him this weekend, and even what we saw out of Jahmyr Gibbs in the last round, Josh Jacobs in the first round of the playoffs, it's tremendous. And it always makes you think what could have been. And when you see Bijan getting his flowers, it's like, dang, what could have been and what could he have gotten? Like Tori said, first off, if maybe the Falcons would have been where we thought they could be. But for you, Tori, there's been a lot of conversation about how both of those championship games ended, one being an absolute drag down, the other being to the line, to the finish line. So when you look at what you want to see replicated for this Falcons team, what did you see from 1, 2, or all of those teams that tells you, hey, this is something that we could replicate here, we should want to replicate here, whether it's how the player played, the coach schemed, or even the philosophy of those organizations?
I feel like the spirit of my father is about to just like embody me and come out, because I'm about to say something that I feel like he has probably said in my lifetime 1,000 times, and every coach has probably said this as well, but it begins and ends in the trenches. You look at those two games, you look at what Saquon Barkley was able to do running the football. Saquon Barkley, give him all of his flowers. He is a special talent. I say the same thing about Bijan, but some of those things don't happen if the holes are not there. If the lanes are not there, and they were there, obviously they were there
from the first play from scrimmage,
literally. And then you look at what the Chiefs were able to do, especially in the second half, affecting Josh Allen. I know we already talked about this earlier in the podcast, but how uncomfortable he was in that second half when the game was on the line. And yes, he made some good plays because he's Josh Allen. But you think about how many times they tried to sneak that dang ball and how many times they maybe got a yard. And how that was just over and over and over. That was a theme of all day yesterday. Championship Sunday to me was all about what was happening at the line of scrimmage, whether it be defensive line or offensive line. With the Eagles, it was offensive line, and also like what they were doing defensively too. I got to shout out like all of my dogs, like my Philly dogs.
No question.
I mean, you cannot talk about the last 24 hours of gameplay without talking about what was happening in the trenches. And that is something that the Falcons have to get better about. I feel good about where they are in terms of running the ball. They've had 3 back-to-back seasons where they have rushed for over 2,000 yards. Solid. I feel good about that. Defensively, that's where things need to change. And to everything that we're talking about, generational teams, to use that word, great teams that win potentially 3 Super Bowls, do not do that without a stout defensive line that comes alive in pass rush and in run blocking. Not one and not the other, both.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, I look at these, the Falcons are going to play 2 of those teams next year. They have Washington on the schedule, they have Buffalo on the schedule, and, who knows if they make the playoffs for the first time in a long time. Maybe they'll play the Philadelphia Eagles at some point in 2025 or 2026. So, watching those games, I'm like, the Falcons have a ways to go if they want to beat some of these teams, and they'll get that test. But, I think piggybacking on what Tori said, the thing I'm looking at is like, if you can own that team in the trenches, or you can go blow for blow, that's really what you're doing if you're facing Philadelphia, because I don't think you're going to own them in the trenches. But if you can go blow for blow with them and hang with them, that's going to put you in a position to succeed against any of those teams. So I do think that's really the thing that, where the Falcons, I think, have the most growth potential, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, when it comes to that. And if they can do that, I think, maybe, just maybe, we'll be talking about them matching up with some of those teams and being like it's a much fairer fight than what it has been in previous matchups.
This might be unfair, but the comfort level that I have when I see Patrick Mahomes roll on the field in a tight situation, I want Michael Penny. I want to feel the same way when Mike MPX runs on the field, and I started to feel that just a little bit. I ain't gonna say it's the same. I ain't had the same feeling, but I was like, you know what? Now I might be able to do this thing on that last drive, against the Washington Commanders when they had the opportunity to win that game. And by the way, the team that went in Detroit's house and kicked they behind, they almost beat that team. Yeah, I think Raheem Morris still is kicking himself for not winning that game. So I want to, based off what I've seen from these games, I want to be able to have that same feeling when Michael Penix runs on the field and they're down by 5 or 6, and it's about 2 minutes left on the clock, and they're on the 30-yard line, get ready to get this drive started. I want to have that same feeling that I felt when Patrick Mahomes ran on the field.
Well, our guys are in Mobile, Alabama, and they've got their eyes on maybe some more guys that can be generational for the Falcons. We'll discuss when we come back. So, Jarvis, you are headed to Mobile. Aaron, you are already in Mobile. And guys, they're there, of course, for the Senior Bowl, which will take place Saturday in Mobile. And, of course, there's also the East-West Shrine game that's taking place, I think, Thursday in Arlington, just outside of Dallas. And that's really where you start to see some guys that kind of are showing you what they're made of. Of course, special teams coordinator Marquise Williams will be the head coach of the East team, but still excited to see you guys in Mobile because you guys have really scouted out a lot of players that turned out to be exactly what you saw. So how important is it for the Falcons to have a presence at those kinds of games, which give you a sneak peek into the 2025 draft, potential draft choices?
Well, I'll say this. I was breaking this down on Locked On Falcons yesterday. I think depending on how you want to count who's at the Senior Bowl, because some guys accept invites and don't actually practice, like Zach Harrison and Luca Rolo. But like 12, if you count those guys as Senior Bowl people, 12 of the Falcons' 15 defensive players that they've drafted have been Senior Bowl guys. That it's one of those things, and when you look at over half of their 31 draft picks under Terry Fontenot have been Senior Bowl guys. So it is very important for the Falcons, based off of the last 4 years under Terry Fontenot, that this week is going to matter. Like, we're going to see some future Falcons, right? Jaden Bertrand last year, Michael Penix last year, some guy by the name Michael Penix, right? So it's one of those things where, like, there are going to be players and I'm like, I'm just planting seeds for later in April when we get to talk about them. And then, me and Jarvis are going to be like, yeah, we saw that guy. And, sometimes we'll be like, he didn't really move the needle for us, but like, hey, we'll get an opportunity to see what he could do in a Falcons uniform. And then sometimes like, man, that guy did some things. And then, probably a few too many times we've talked about guys that did some things that the Falcons didn't necessarily draft. I remember Keon White years ago. But it's one of those things where I think this week is
Yaya Diaby.
It's a big week for the Falcons based off of their recent draft history. And so I think there's going to be a lot of young guys, particularly on the defense side of the ball, that I know Jarvis and I will be focusing all week long to see what they can do.
And I think, being how pivotal this year is, I would not be surprised if they get a couple of guys, maybe even 3 guys from the Senior Bowl, and I even asked, Ulbrich, after the press conference, I was like, you want down there? He's like, yeah, he's just trying to get everything settled in right now. So he got a lot to kind of get into before he tries to make a trip down the Senior Bowl and see what's going on. So I feel like there'll be a heavy presence from as far as their personnel, office, like they had last year. So I feel they need to have their eyes on several guys down here, because this draft is a defensive line heavy draft. So I can't wait to get my eyes on a couple of guys. I already got a guy like the D tackle out of Kentucky, Deion Walker. He's like 6'7", like 340. I was like, what? Yes, please. Yes. Let's see what's going on down there in Mobile. So yeah, can't wait to get down there, and I'm sure the Falcons will have at least most hands on deck when it comes to trying to see if they can, what type of talent they can bring in.
Yeah. And I know when the minute you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, a la Zach Harrison, a la Calais Campbell, just that height and that girth and everything. So yeah, yes. I mean, yeah, that would make me smile too, because we've seen what that kind of stature can be with Campbell, and of course we're starting to see what it can be for Harrison as well. Well, listen, before we go, and ultimately we'll talk a little bit more about this on Thursday's show, because you guys will both have seen some things that we can actually react to, and hopefully we'll have some reaction as well, or some things that maybe Marquise Williams sees at East West. But in Atlanta, there has been nothing but evolution of the hip hop scene. And there's so many legends that I feel like we're losing we're having this conversation way too often, and we're having this conversation yet again, because one of the legends from right here in Atlanta, DJ Unk, passed away this weekend at the age of 43. And I know some of us have had the opportunity to see him in person, kind of tear it down at the Mercedes-Benz. So just wanted to give you guys a chance to speak on him, and definitely just send our condolences to the family and the fan base.
Yeah, DJ Unk was a guy growing up in the city of Atlanta. He's a guy that you understand, like, was the sound of Atlanta when they came out, right? The guy we're the exact same age. He was born in 1982. To lead this world that early, I feel this early in my heart. So for what they were able to do at their time with Kemp and Big and all those guys, man, those guys were like local legends. And then for them to have a local neighborhood song just blow up like it did, and then Andre 3 Stacks get on the track. Oh, what? Yeah. Oh my gosh! I know. Unk felt like he had an effect on the city of Atlanta for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I know this week at the Senior Bowl, when I'm watching some of these pass rushers, right, a big part of what they do when it comes to some of these speed rushers is like how much ground can you gain in your first couple of steps. And so I'm going to be thinking about that 2-step, when I'm thinking about, that get off with the pass rush and whatnot. So that is something that, that legacy will live on. And that song will be going in my head every day at practice as I watch some of these guys to sort of see how much ground can they gain in those first 2 steps and thinking about that song and whatnot.
That was an excellent analogy, by the way, Free. Yeah,
it really was. I don't even want to. You know what? I'm going to leave it right there because I think that was a beautiful analogy from Free. Thanks to our everydayers for making the Atlanta football party your first listen of the day. Be sure to stop by Locked on Falcons with Aaron and his frequent guest analyst Jarvis as your second listen. And check out Tori's one-on-one with Jeff Ulbrich on the Falcons YouTube page. We will see you next time. Itchy, itchy, itchy.